It started with one story, one girl nearly beheaded and stabbed more than 30 times, who survived. Brutal, but clear. Then I found another, and that's when I realized some people don't survive the wild. They survive something deeper, something designed to erase them. That's where we're going today. It happened in South Africa during the first weeks of summer in December 1994, in the coastal city of Port Elizabeth. Allison Botha was 27 years old. She had spent the evening with friends, laughing, catching up, saying goodbye to a warm night, with no sense that something irreversible was about to happen. She parked her car just outside her apartment, not far from the sea, and as she stepped out and turned to close the door, a man appeared, holding a knife. He didn't shout, didn't make a scene, didn't look wild or frantic. He simply told her to move over to the passenger seat, and she did. In that moment, what she understood, without needing words, was that something terrible had already been decided. He drove, then stopped to pick up another man. Now, there were two of them. She didn't ask where they were going because she already knew it wouldn't be somewhere she could walk away from. They headed toward the brushlands beyond the city, near Schoenmakerskop, an isolated area by the sea, where no lights reached, no people passed, and no sound carried. They turned off the road and parked the car. She was taken out, pushed into the sand. What followed was brutal and deliberate, but what matters is not what they did. It's what she survived. After they assaulted her, they tried to kill her. They started by strangling her. When that didn't work, they stabbed her, over 30 times in the abdomen and chest. Then they used a knife on her neck. 16 deep cuts, so violent that her trachea was exposed, and her head was nearly severed. There was no hesitation in what they did, no doubt. They left her in the dirt, bleeding, exposed, mutilated, and as far as they knew, dead. But Allison didn't die. She regained consciousness a short time later, lying on her back in the sand, under the stars, in silence. She remembers that strange stillness, the cold of the ground beneath her, the wetness of her own blood pooling in the dust. She couldn't breathe through her mouth because her trachea was cut. She couldn't speak, couldn't cry for help, but she could think. She could feel her lungs moving air through the hole in her neck. She could feel her stomach open, her organs outside her body, and she could feel, maybe more than anything, that she was still here. And so she made a decision. She began to crawl, not in a rush, not in a panic, just methodically, with focus. One hand on her neck, holding her head in place so it wouldn't fall backward. One hand pressed to her stomach, keeping her insides from spilling out more than they already had. She dragged her body across sand and stone, through thorns and brush, with nothing guiding her except the idea that somewhere, not too far away, there might still be a road. And if she could reach it, someone might see her. At one point, she stopped, found a stick, and wrote in the dirt the names of her attackers, just in case she died before anyone found her. She didn't feel pain in the way you'd expect. Her brain had entered some other mode, disconnected from the body that was failing beneath her. She says it felt like floating above herself, watching her own arms move, watching the ground pass beneath her, as if she were not really part of what was happening. But she kept going. Every movement, every shift of weight was deliberate. There was no adrenaline, no energy to spare. There was only the next inch forward. Eventually, after what felt like an eternity, but was likely less than an hour, she reached the road. She lay there, exposed, barely breathing, holding herself together, literally. And then headlights appeared, a car slowed, the driver got out, unsure of what he was seeing. It didn't look like a living person. It didn't look like something he should get close to. But then he saw her eyes open, looking directly at him, focused, present, alive. She was rushed to the hospital. The medical team didn't expect her to make it through the night. Her trachea was sliced through. She was breathing through an open wound in her neck. Her intestines were outside her body. Her blood pressure was almost non-existent, but none of the stab wounds had pierced a major artery. None of the neck wounds had severed her spine. It was as if her body had been destroyed with surgical precision, but had missed every single thing it needed to keep going. She underwent multiple surgeries, and against all odds, she survived. She spoke again, she ate again, she walked, she lived. And then she did something even harder. She remembered. She gave testimony. She identified her attackers. She helped put them behind bars. And then, instead of disappearing from public view, she stepped forward, not with anger, not with sensationalism, but with the quiet force of someone who had walked through something unthinkable and returned with her voice intact. She wrote a book, I Have Life. She became a speaker, a mother, a face that survivors could look at and see something other than pain. And for years, she carried that role with grace. Then, in 2023, something shifted. Her attackers were released on parole. After all the trials, after all the healing, after all the work to turn that night into something survivable, they were free. And she wasn't. Not really, because trauma doesn't end when the wounds close. It doesn't obey prison sentences. It stays in the room, it wakes you up, it changes the way you move through the world. And when the men who tried to erase you walk free, it comes back, fast, cold, and familiar. She spoke again, this time not as a speaker or a survivor, but as a woman afraid, tired, and hurt by a system that still didn't understand what survival really meant. But she never stopped standing. And when I finished reading her story, I thought that was the end of the rabbit hole, that nothing could be more extreme, more physical, more immediate than what Allison Botha endured. But then I came across something else, something quieter. A girl who wasn't left bleeding in the dark, but kept alive, under control, in plain sight. A different kind of captivity, a different kind of survival. And that's when I realized something that's haunted me since. Sometimes the fight for survival doesn't look like crawling through the dirt. Sometimes it looks like smiling, obeying, pretending, and hoping someone someday will see you. Let's talk about Elizabeth Smart. If you've made it this far, it probably means this story is hitting somewhere real. We take time to make these videos, to tell true survival stories with care, without shortcuts. So, if that matters to you, consider subscribing. It helps us keep going. Elizabeth Smart's story doesn't begin with a chase or a scream. It begins in the most ordinary place, a warm bedroom in a quiet home, in the middle of the night while the city sleeps. It was June 2002 in Salt Lake City, Utah. 14-year-old Elizabeth was asleep in her bed, next to her younger sister. The house was still. The air was calm. A window had been left open to let in the breeze. That small detail, so normal, so innocent, was the point of entry. A man slipped inside. He was barefoot, carrying a knife. His name was Brian David Mitchell, and he had once worked at the Smart family home as a handyman. Now he believed he was a prophet. He saw Elizabeth not as a person, but as a girl chosen for him by God. He woke her with the flat of the blade against her skin. He told her not to make a sound. He whispered threats, not only against her, but against her family. He told her to come with him, quietly, or he would kill them all. She followed him out of the house, barefoot and confused, as her sister pretended to be asleep, too afraid to move. Elizabeth was led into the night, into the woods, into something she didn't yet understand. She didn't scream, she didn't fight, she simply left. They walked for hours, up into the hills behind her neighborhood, into the forest, where Mitchell and his wife Wanda Barzee had built a crude camp from tarps and ropes. There, under the trees, in a clearing barely wide enough to lie down, Elizabeth was chained, not just physically, but symbolically, dressed in white robes, veiled, declared Mitchell's spiritual wife. He said she had been chosen by God. He said this was her sacred duty. And then he began to abuse her. The abuse was daily, sometimes several times a day. Physical, sexual, psychological. Barzee, his wife, took part in the control, helping to keep Elizabeth confined, manipulated, and silenced. The camp was isolated, but not far from homes and hikers. Elizabeth heard voices. She saw people pass nearby. Once the police came within a few hundred meters, even brought dogs. She didn't call out. She didn't run. Because Mitchell had told her that if she tried, he would kill her and then kill her family. She believed him. She was 14. The months passed. She was kept chained to a tree or to a post inside the tent. She was starved, sometimes not fed for days. When she was allowed to eat, it was whatever scraps Mitchell decided she could have. There was no clean water, no real shelter, no medical care. She was forced to take drugs, to endure religious rituals, to participate in bizarre ceremonies meant to purify her. She was no longer Elizabeth Smart, daughter of a loving family. She was now a possession, a girl stripped of her name, her clothes, and her voice. They didn't stay in the same place. At one point, they walked miles to another hidden camp, then later hitched rides and traveled to California. When they returned to Utah, Mitchell began bringing Elizabeth out in public, disguised in heavy robes and veils. She would stand beside him while he preached on street corners. She would walk through stores, past people, past signs with her own face printed on them, missing posters everywhere, and no one recognized her. The fear was constant, but so was the calculation. Elizabeth later explained that she developed a strategy, not to fight, not to escape, but to comply just enough to stay alive. She would do what he said, say what he wanted, but inside, she kept a separate world. She thought of her family, imagined them still looking for her, still waiting. She prayed, not for rescue at first, but just to survive one more day, then the next. She remembers the cold at night, the way her bones ached from sleeping on the ground, the shame of being forced to bathe in front of her captors, the silence of the trees, and the terrifying unpredictability of Mitchell's moods. She learned to read him, to sense when he was dangerous and when she could breathe. But there was never safety, only moments less dangerous than others. And then, one day in March 2003, 9 months after she had vanished, she was walking down a sidewalk in the town of Sandy, Utah, next to Mitchell and Barzee, dressed head to toe in robes. Someone recognized her. A young man had seen her picture recently. He called the police. Officers approached her. She denied who she was at first, afraid it was a trick, afraid of what Mitchell might do. But then one of the officers spoke gently, told her it was okay, that she was safe, that she could come home. She said her name, and everything changed. Elizabeth was reunited with her family that same day. Physically, she was malnourished and exhausted. Psychologically, she had been held hostage for nearly a year. But she was alive, she was home, and she had remembered who she was. The world followed her return with fascination, but also confusion. How had she not escaped? Why hadn't she screamed? Why didn't she fight? The answer in time became clear. She survived by staying alive. She adapted. She did what she had to. And when the moment came to be rescued, she said her name. Over the years, Elizabeth chose not to disappear. She testified in court. She wrote books, My Story and Where There's Hope. She founded a foundation to support victims of abduction and abuse. She appeared in documentaries, gave speeches, spoke about trauma and recovery, not as a perfect survivor, but as a human being who had lived through something that most people can't even imagine. She married, had children, continued to talk, continued to walk into spaces where her story could help someone else survive. Not because it was her job, but because she knew what silence can cost. What strikes me about Elizabeth's story is not just the horror of it or the endurance it took, but the stillness inside it, the way she stayed present while being erased, the way she carried her sense of self like a secret seed kept underground, untouched by the cold. There was no chase, no dramatic escape, no defiance that looked heroic from the outside. There was just a girl, stolen from her life, who chose, quietly, daily, not to vanish. And that, in its own way, is one of the most powerful forms of survival I've ever come across. Elizabeth's story taught me that survival isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, invisible, a long wait behind a veil. But just when I thought I'd reached the end of that path, I found something else. A case even more hidden, even more controlled. Colleen Stan wasn't just taken, she was kept for 7 years. Let's go there. In May of 1977, Colleen Stan was just 20 years old. Independent, curious, and adventurous, she was hitchhiking her way down Interstate 5, heading from Eugene to a friend's birthday party in California. It wasn't unusual then. The highways were full of young people thumbing rides across the West. She turned down 2 rides that didn't feel right. Then a van pulled up. Inside was a young man, his wife, and their baby. It felt safe enough. Colleen got in. She had no way of knowing she was stepping into a trap that would hold her for 7 years. At first, the ride was quiet. The man driving, Cameron Hooker, didn't say much. His wife, Janice, barely looked at Colleen. They stopped at a gas station. Colleen went to the bathroom, looked at the lock, hesitated for a second. Something felt off, But then she walked back to the van. A few miles down the road, the tone shifted. Cameron pulled over. He took out a knife. Without warning, he bound Colleen's hands, gagged her, and placed something over her head. A wooden box, heavy and tight, built to muffle sound, block light, and erase her sense of the world. Then he drove her to Red Bluff, California, to the basement of his home. There, Colleen was placed in a coffin-like box beneath the couple's bed. She would spend up to 23 hours a day inside it. Her world shrank to that dark, airless space, with barely enough room to turn her shoulders. For the first few weeks, she was not a person. She was a possession. Hooker referred to her not as Colleen, but as the girl. The torture was systematic. Hooker suspended her from the ceiling. He whipped her, burned her, electrocuted her. He assaulted her repeatedly. He kept her chained, blindfolded, gagged. When she was allowed out of the box, it was to be used, or to be conditioned. But physical control wasn't enough. Hooker introduced a psychological mechanism that would keep her obedient even outside the walls of that basement. He told her about an organization called The Company, a secretive, all-powerful network that monitored her every move. If she tried to escape or even spoke the truth, they would kill her family. He fabricated documents. He staged fake phone calls. He built a world of fear where nothing felt safe, not even her own thoughts. Over time, Colleen stopped resisting. She submitted. She signed a fake slave contract. She was given permission to speak only when spoken to. She referred to Hooker as master. He began taking her outside, for walks, for errands, even bringing her to visit his parents. She never tried to flee. The psychological walls were higher than any prison. For 7 years, this was her life. Sometimes she was in the box. Sometimes she was cleaning the house. Sometimes she was gardening in silence. Always she was terrified. Always she believed she was being watched. But even in that darkness, something endured. She kept a part of herself alive, the smallest fragment of will folded deep inside. She learned his moods, avoided punishment, waited. Not for a miracle, just for a shift. And eventually it came. Not from Hooker, but from Janice. Janice had been part of the deception, but she was also unraveling. She had her own trauma, her own complicity, and over time, she began to break. In 1984, after years of silence, Janice told Colleen the truth. There was no company, no secret agents, no death squads. It was all a lie. That same year, while Hooker was at work, Janice took Colleen to a bus station. She called her father, and just like that, after 2,620 days, she was free. The aftermath was complex. Colleen didn't call the police right away. She was disoriented, unsure how to explain what had happened. Eventually, Janice turned Cameron in. He was arrested, tried, and sentenced to 104 years in prison. Janice, in exchange for her testimony, received immunity. Colleen tried to rebuild. She suffered from chronic pain in her shoulders and back from the years spent in confinement. But she went back to school. She got a degree, she married, she had a child. And slowly she began to speak, not just for herself, but for others who had survived the impossible. What Colleen endured wasn't just a story of captivity. It was a study in psychological domination, of how fear can build its own walls, stronger than any chains. Her survival wasn't about fighting back with force. It was about enduring, day after day, in a world that tried to erase her. And sometimes, survival doesn't look like escaping through a window or fighting off an attacker in the night. Sometimes it looks like silence, like obedience, like a woman waiting, listening, breathing, until she sees a door she can finally walk through. Not all survival stories leave scars you can see. Some go quiet, some go unnoticed, but they're no less real, and maybe even harder to carry. Sometimes the hardest thing isn't escaping, it's staying whole.